You know, I always figured my biggest problem with the homeowners association, the dreaded HOA, would be something mundane. The classic stuff, right? The color of my mailbox being a shade too rebellious, maybe the grass on my 5 acres daring to grow a quarter-inch beyond their meticulously defined community standard. I've heard the horror stories. Never, not in a million years, did I imagine their overreach would escalate to the point of a full-blown, unauthorized fiesta in my private barn. A confrontation involving two of my rather substantial 2,000-pound prize bulls, and me, your humble narrator, miles away, serenely fishing while the whole chaotic symphony played out. But as life often reminds us, reality can be far stranger, and occasionally far more satisfying, than fiction. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from today, because the tale I'm about to unfold, it's a testament to the fact that sometimes the best defense is a good, solid, well-locked barn door and a couple of very large, very unimpressed bovines. It all started, as these things often do, with a new sheriff in town, or rather, a new queen in her self-proclaimed suburban kingdom. My little slice of heaven isn't exactly sprawling ranch country, but it's a decent spread on the edge of a rapidly developing area, one of those places where old farmsteads are slowly being encroached upon by newer, more uniform housing developments, complete with their own set of, shall we say, enthusiastic governance. I'd owned my land for 15 years, long before the Whispering Pines Estates even existed. My property was grandfathered in, mostly exempt from their petty tyrannies, a fact that seemed to endlessly irritate the new HOA president, a woman we'll call Brenda. Brenda, with her perfectly coiffed helmet of blonde hair that looked like it could withstand a Category 3 hurricane, her perpetually pursed lips, and a voice that could curdle milk at 50 paces, had taken over the HOA board about a year prior. She drove a gleaming white SUV, the kind that screamed, "I need to speak to the manager," and seemed to consider my more rustic, agriculturally inclined property an unfortunate blemish on her vision of pristine, homogeneous suburbia. My barn isn't some dilapidated shack. It's a sturdy, well-maintained structure, classic red with white trim, a bit of an icon in the older part of the area. It's where I keep my tools, some vintage tractor equipment I'm slowly restoring, and most importantly, it's the winter shelter and occasional secure pen for my two prize Charolais bulls, Duke and Earl. These aren't just cattle, they're magnificent animals, each tipping the scales at a solid ton, with lineages I can trace back further than some of my neighbors can trace their own. They're generally placid, gentle giants, but their sheer size commands respect, or at least it should. The barn is strictly a working building, smelling of hay, earth, and honest labor, not party punch and desperation. The first inkling of trouble came disguised as a syrupy, sweet request. Brenda, flanked by her equally smug HOA vice president, a weaselly little man named Gary who always looked like he was about to apologize for existing, appeared at my farmhouse door one sunny Saturday morning. "Mr. Henderson," Brenda began, her voice dripping with forced congeniality, "the HOA is planning our annual summer gala, a lovely community event, and we were thinking your charming, rustic barn would be the most delightful, authentic venue." I remember nearly choking on my coffee. My barn? For a gala? The image of 100 or so cul-de-sac commandos in their summer finery, trying to navigate manure-dusted concrete floors and dodge pitchforks, was almost comical. "Brenda," I said, keeping my tone polite but firm, "I appreciate the thought, but the barn is a working agricultural building. It houses livestock, valuable equipment, and frankly, it's not equipped or safe for public gatherings. The insurance implications alone would be a nightmare. So no, I'm afraid that won't be possible." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes, little chips of blue ice, hardened. "Oh, don't you worry about a thing, Mr. Henderson. We'd handle all the cleanup, of course. And we have event insurance. It would be such a wonderful gesture of community spirit." Some of the newer residents feel a bit disconnected from the agricultural heritage you represent. The subtle condescension wasn't lost on me. My agricultural heritage was apparently a quaint relic to be trotted out for their amusement. Gary just nodded vigorously beside her, his head bobbing like a dashboard ornament. "No, Brenda," I reiterated. "The answer is no. It's private property, it's a working barn, and it's not available. I'm sure you can find a more suitable and frankly appropriate venue in town." Her lips thinned into a razor line. "We'll see about that, Mr. Henderson," she chirped, the sweetness entirely gone, replaced by a steely glint. "Community spirit is very important around here." They turned on their heels, her SUV kicking up a little cloud of dust from my gravel driveway as they departed, a tiny symbolic act of aggression. I shook my head, a knot of unease tightening in my gut. This wasn't over. People like Brenda didn't take no for an answer. They saw it as a challenge. I made a mental note to check the latches on my gates and barn doors. That evening, I saw their monthly newsletter, conveniently left in my mailbox despite my not being a paying HOA member. Prominently displayed was the announcement, "Oh, Summer Gala to be held at the historic Henderson Barn, a touch of country charm for our community." I felt a surge of incredulous anger. They were actually advertising it, as if my refusal had been a mere formality they'd simply chosen to ignore. This wasn't just overreach anymore. This was a declaration of war, suburban style. The audacity was breathtaking. They hadn't just ignored my refusal, they'd steamrollered right over it, printing it in their newsletter like it was a done deal. My initial disbelief quickly morphed into a cold, simmering anger. I'm a patient man, generally. I've dealt with stubborn livestock, unpredictable weather, and equipment that breaks down at the worst possible moment. I understand persistence. But this wasn't persistence. This was blatant, arrogant disregard for private property rights, for basic common courtesy. Brenda and her little HOA cabal were acting as if my land, my barn, my life's work was theirs to command. I picked up the phone and called the HOA office number listed in the newsletter. It went straight to a chirpy voicemail message from Brenda, extolling the virtues of Whispering Pines Estates. I left a message, polite but unequivocal. "Brenda, this is Tom Henderson. I'm calling about the Summer Gala announcement. To reiterate, my barn is not available for your event or any other event. It is private property, and you do not have my permission to use it. Please retract this announcement immediately and find an alternative venue. Any attempt to access my property without my express consent will be considered trespassing." I knew it was probably a futile gesture, like reasoning with a swarm of angry hornets, but I needed it on record, even if it was just my voice on her machine. The next few days were a masterclass in passive-aggressive HOA warfare. I received no callback, no correction in any subsequent email blast they sent out, which I only knew about because a sympathetic neighbor, old Mrs. Gable from down the road, would occasionally forward me the important ones with a note saying, "Thought you should see this, Tom. That woman's a menace." Instead, I started noticing little things. A car I didn't recognize, suspiciously similar to Gary's beige sedan, driving slowly past my property line multiple times a day. One afternoon, while I was mending a fence near the road, I saw Brenda herself, parked just beyond my driveway, peering towards the barn through a pair of binoculars like she was scouting enemy territory. The sheer nerve of it. I waved, a big, deliberate, not entirely friendly wave. She quickly lowered the binoculars and sped off. It was clear they were proceeding with their plans. My objections be damned. They were counting on me to what? Cave in? Be intimidated? Or perhaps they simply didn't care, believing their HOA authority somehow superseded my property deeds. This is where my background, a mix of practical farming and a few semesters of agricultural engineering back in college, started to kick in. I wasn't just going to get angry, I was going to get prepared. My first step was to meticulously document everything. I saved a copy of their newsletter. I made a written log of my phone call, the date, the time, the content of the message. I noted the instances of suspicious surveillance. I even took a couple of discreet photos with my phone when Brenda was doing her binocular reconnaissance. Evidence, I've always believed, is king. Next, I brushed up on local trespass laws and property rights. No surprises there. My land was my land. An HOA had zero jurisdiction to compel me to host their shindig. Their community standards ended where my property line began. I also considered the liability. If one of their guests got kicked by a bull they weren't supposed to be near, or tripped over a hay bale in a poorly lit area they shouldn't have entered, who would be responsible? Me, potentially, for an attractive nuisance if I didn't take reasonable steps to secure my property. But if they broke in, that was a different story. The bulls, Duke and Earl, became central to my evolving plan. They were already due to be moved into the main section of the barn for a few weeks. I was rotating their pasture, and the barn offered good shade and easy access to water during the transition. Normally, if I was going to be away, I'd secure them in their large, reinforced stall within the barn. But if they were simply in the main barn area, the very area Brenda probably envisioned stringing up fairy lights and setting up a canapé table, well, that wasn't my problem, was it? They weren't aggressive, not unless seriously provoked, but 2 tons of curious snorting bull has a way of discouraging uninvited guests. My plan began to crystallize. It wasn't about confronting them head-on before the party. That would just lead to arguments, more threats, and potentially them trying some legal maneuver, however flimsy. No, this required a more subtle approach. I would simply secure my property as any responsible landowner would, especially before leaving for a few days. And I just so happened to have a long-planned fishing trip scheduled for that exact weekend. I'm an avid fisherman. Every year around that time, I head up to Miller's Lake, a good 3-hour drive away, for a couple of days of peace, quiet, and, if I'm lucky, a few decent-sized trout. My friends knew about it. I'd had the dates marked on my calendar for months. It was the perfect alibi because it wasn't an alibi at all, it was just my life. The HOA's disastrously timed party was purely coincidental to my pre-existing, entirely legitimate plans. The beauty of it was its simplicity. I wouldn't be there to argue, to protest, or to be blamed for ruining their precious gala. I would just be fishing. The barn would be locked. The bulls would be inside, comfortable and secure in their usual shelter. If a group of determined trespassers decided to overcome those obstacles, well, that was on them. I started paying extra attention to the barn's security. The main sliding doors were heavy timber, secured from the inside by a thick wooden beam dropped into iron brackets, and from the outside by a heavy-duty padlock. I serviced that padlock, making sure it was well-oiled and functioning perfectly. I also discovered a couple of old rusted bolt locks on a smaller side access door that I'd forgotten about. I spent an afternoon meticulously cleaning them, oiling them, and ensuring they were now in perfect working order. They were the kind that, once bolted from the inside, were impossible to open from the outside without causing significant damage. Just good, solid security for my valuable assets, animal and mechanical. Nothing more, nothing less. The day before their gala, Mrs. Gable called. "Tom," she said, her voice hushed. "I heard Brenda at the community mailbox, suited bare, bragging to that dreadful Gary about how they've got a surprise workaround for your uncooperative attitude regarding the barn. Said something about a master key to the side door from the previous owner. You know the one, old Mr. Abernathy, bless his forgetful soul." I thanked her profusely. Old Mr. Abernathy hadn't owned this place in 20 years, and any key he might have possessed would have been for locks I'd replaced ages ago. But this confirmed they were actively planning to unlawfully enter. My resolve hardened. They were walking right into it. The morning of the scheduled gala dawned bright and clear, a perfect summer day. I went about my usual chores. The chickens were fed, the garden watered. Then I turned my attention to Duke and Earl. They were already in their pasture adjacent to the barn. With a bucket of sweet feed as encouragement, I led them into the main spacious central area of the barn, the exact spot I imagined Brenda envisioned her dance floor. It was clean, bedded with fresh straw, and their large water trough was filled to the brim. I scattered a generous amount of their favorite alfalfa hay. They seemed perfectly content, munching away, occasionally snorting with satisfaction. These weren't just props in my little drama, they were valuable animals, and their welfare was, as always, my priority. Once they were settled, I began to secure the barn. The big, heavy sliding doors at the front rumbled shut, and I dropped the massive internal wooden beam into its iron brackets. Thunk! A very satisfying sound. Then I went outside and clicked the heavy-duty padlock into place on the external hasp. Solid. Next, I moved to the smaller side access door, the one Mrs. Gable had mentioned. From the inside, I slid the 2 newly refurbished sturdy steel bolts into their sockets. Double thunk. That door wasn't opening from the outside without a crowbar and a lot of incriminating noise. I checked a few high windows. They were all latched securely from the inside, too high to reach without a tall ladder anyway. The barn was now a bovine fortress. My property, my animals, properly secured. My conscience was clear. With the barn buttoned up tighter than a drum, I turned to my fishing trip preparations. This wasn't just for show. I genuinely looked forward to these trips. I loaded my truck, tackle box meticulously organized, rods carefully stowed, waders, cooler packed with sandwiches and drinks, a worn copy of a favorite fishing essays book. Anyone seeing me would see a man heading off for a well-deserved weekend escape. As I was about to pull out of my driveway, I saw one of the HOA's security patrol golf carts, another of Brenda's ridiculous initiatives, trundle past the end of my road. The driver, a bored-looking teenager probably roped into it for community service hours, glanced my way with mild disinterest. I gave a cheerful wave, a picture of carefree contentment. He probably just figured old Henderson was off on one of his trips. Perfect. The 3-hour drive to Miller's Lake was uneventful. I listened to some classic rock, enjoyed the scenery, and felt a growing sense of calm, tinged with a distinct undercurrent of amused anticipation. I knew with absolute certainty what was likely unfolding back at Whispering Pines. Back at the farm, I could only imagine the scene, though subsequent reports from amused neighbors and the sheer apoplectic rage in Brenda's later voicemails painted a vivid picture. The HOA party committee, likely led by a triumphant Brenda in some garish floral sundress, would have arrived mid-afternoon, caterers in tow, ready to transform my charming, rustic barn into their gala venue. They'd have found the main doors locked. Annoyance quickly turning to frustration. Then, remembering Brenda's master key delusion, or perhaps just emboldened by their own sense of entitlement, they would have scurried around to the side door. Imagine their smug confidence turning to baffled rage as that door too refused to yield. I could almost hear Brenda's screech. What is the meaning of this? That uncooperative old fool. At some point, their desperation must have overridden what little common sense they possessed. They were committed. Guests would be arriving soon. Decorations, probably cheap streamers and balloons, were waiting to be hung. I heard later from Mrs. Gable, who had a prime viewing spot from her kitchen window, that they spent a good 20 minutes rattling the doors, peering through dusty window panes, their voices growing increasingly shrill. Then, someone, probably Gary, eager to please, or some overly enthusiastic volunteer, must have noticed one of the small, high ventilation shutters. It was latched, but perhaps not as robustly as the main doors. With a ladder borrowed from a nearby and equally unconsenting neighbor's shed, they managed to pry it open. A slim volunteer, perhaps a teenager, was then hoisted up and squeezed through the opening. A moment of triumph for the HOA. They were in. The volunteer would have landed in the hay, then unbolted the side door from the inside to let in the rest of the triumphant, slightly disheveled party planners. And then they would have seen them. Duke and Earl, 2 tons of bull, each standing there in the dim light of the barn, probably blinking slowly, wondering who these noisy, brightly colored intruders were. They wouldn't have been aggressive. Charolais are generally curious but calm. But their sheer, unadulterated presence in the middle of what was supposed to be a dance floor would have been, to put it mildly, a showstopper. I can picture Brenda's face, a mask of crimson fury and dawning horror. Her perfectly planned gala, her moment of HOA glory, now co-starring 2 enormous farm animals who were distinctly off-script and definitely not on the guest list. Food tables would have been hastily abandoned. The DJ they'd hired, probably setting up his equipment, would have paused, turntable scratching. The caterers would be looking for the nearest exit. Panic, thinly veiled or openly expressed, would have rippled through their ranks. "Get them out! Get those beasts out of here!" Brenda would have shrieked. But how? Duke and Earl weren't going anywhere they didn't want to go, especially not at the behest of a hysterical woman in a floral dress, and no one in their right mind was going to try and physically move them. The party, for all intents and purposes, was over before it began. The charming, rustic atmosphere had become a little too authentic for their tastes. Meanwhile, miles away, I'd just landed my first trout of the day. A beautiful rainbow, fighting like a champion. The sun was warm on my face, the water cool against my waders, and my phone, tucked away in my fishing vest, was blissfully silent, for now. I knew the calls would come, and I knew I'd enjoy ignoring them. My fishing trip was idyllic. The water at Miller's Lake was crystal clear, the air crisp and clean, a world away from HOA politics and barnyard showdowns. I caught a decent string of trout, released a few smaller ones, and generally soaked in the tranquility. Around late afternoon on that first day, as I was expertly filleting a particularly nice brown trout by the lakeside, I finally checked my phone. As anticipated, it had exploded. A cascade of missed calls and voicemails, primarily from a number I recognized as Brenda's, and a few from unknown numbers which I suspected were her flustered party committee members. I pressed play on the first of Brenda's messages, a smirk playing on my lips. Her voice, usually so controlled and imperious, was a high-pitched squeak of fury and panic. "Mr. Henderson! This is Brenda Pinter from the HOA. You call me back this instant. Your animals are in the barn. We have a gala. You have deliberately sabotaged our community event. This is outrageous. You will be hearing from our lawyers." The next message was even more frantic, with background noise suggesting considerable chaos, distant shouts, maybe even a nervous moo. "Henderson, are you getting these messages? There are two enormous things in here. People are frightened. You need to come back and remove them immediately. This is completely irresponsible." And so it went, each message escalating in tone from indignant to apoplectic. There were threats of lawsuits, accusations of endangering the public, bemoaning the ruin of her perfectly planned event. It was music to my ears. I listened to a couple more, savoring the sheer, unadulterated panic, then switched my phone to silent and went back to my fishing. They'd dug their own hole. They could figure out how to fill it with something other than bull manure. I returned home late Sunday afternoon, as planned, my cooler full of fresh trout, feeling refreshed and thoroughly vindicated. As I turned onto my road, I could see the signs of the previous day's debacle. My gravel driveway had more tire tracks than usual, some deep ruts near the barn suggesting panicked departures. There was a forlorn-looking string of deflated balloons caught on my fence line, a casualty of their failed fiesta. And, parked discreetly down the road, observing my return, was a county sheriff's vehicle. Predictable. Brenda, in her rage and frustration, had undoubtedly called the authorities, hoping to paint me as the villain. I pulled into my driveway, gave a polite nod to the deputy, and began unloading my fishing gear, projecting an air of a man returning from a pleasant, entirely normal weekend. The deputy, a youngish fellow with a sensible expression, approached me. "Mr. Henderson?" he asked. "Yes, officer. Can I help you?" I replied, all innocence. "We had a call yesterday, sir. A complaint from the Homeowners Association regarding, livestock in your barn preventing them from holding an event." "An event?" I feigned surprise. "In my barn? Officer, this is private property. I haven't authorized any event here." I then calmly and methodically laid out my side of the story. I explained Brenda's initial request and my explicit refusal. I mentioned the HOA newsletter announcing the event despite my refusal. I showed him the log of my phone call reiterating my position. I told them unequivocally no. I stated. When they persisted in advertising it, I assumed they'd eventually find another venue. The barn is a working agricultural building, officer. It houses my prize bulls, Duke and Earl. Before I left for my annual fishing trip on Friday, a trip I take every year, you can ask anyone, I secured my animals in the barn, as is my standard practice for their safety and the security of my property when I'm away. They have food, water, shelter. It's their home. The deputy listened patiently, occasionally jotting notes. Just then, Brenda's white SUV screeched to a halt at the end of my driveway, and she stormed out, Gary trailing nervously in her wake like a stressed chihuahua. "There he is, officer," she shrieked, pointing an accusing finger. "That man deliberately locked those vicious beasts in there to ruin everything. He's a menace. He endangered the public. Our caterers fled. Guests were terrified." I remained calm. "Brenda," I said, my voice even, "my bulls are not vicious. They were secured inside my own barn, on my own property. You, on the other hand, appear to have trespassed, and from the look of that pry mark on the ventilation shutter, possibly caused property damage trying to break in." I turned to the deputy. "Officer, I'd like to know how they even got into a locked barn. I secured all entrances before I left." The deputy looked at Brenda. "Ma'am, Did you or anyone from your association enter Mr. Henderson's barn without his permission? Brenda sputtered. Well, we assumed. The newsletter, it was a community event. Gary piped up feebly. Someone found an open shutter. So you admit to trespassing, I stated matter-of-factly. The deputy held up a hand. All right, let's calm down. Mr. Henderson, you're saying the barn was locked and your animals were secured inside for their welfare while you were away on a pre-planned trip. That's correct, officer, and I have documentation of my refusal to host their event. I even offered to show him the email from Mrs. Gable about the master key nonsense, illustrating their premeditated intent to enter. Brenda was practically vibrating with rage. This is an outrage. We're the HOA. We have standards. The deputy, however, was looking less impressed with Brenda by the second. He'd seen this kind of petty power trip before. He asked me if the animals were currently safe and if I could check on them. Of course, I said. I walked over to the barn, unlocked the padlock, and slid open the heavy door. Duke and Earl blinked in the sudden sunlight, looking perfectly calm, if a bit curious about the audience. They'd clearly been undisturbed. As you can see, officer, I said. Perfectly fine, just a bit confused as to why their home was invaded. The deputy nodded. He then turned to Brenda. Ma'am, based on what Mr. Mace Henderson has told me, and the fact that this is clearly his private property which he repeatedly stated was not available, it appears your association was trespassing. Forcing entry into a locked building is a serious matter. I'd advise you to consider this a formal warning. Any further attempts to access Mr. Placed and 26 Henderson's property without his express, written permission will result in charges. Brenda's face went from crimson to a sort of mottled purple. She looked like she was about to explode. Gary just seemed to shrink. The deputy then suggested that if I had any damages to the lock, the shutter, or if the animals had been unduly stressed, I could pursue that civilly. My little fishing trip had yielded quite the catch indeed. The fallout from Brenda's barnyard bacchanal bungle was, to put it mildly, spectacular. The deputy's firm admonishment, delivered right there in my driveway with me looking on calmly and Gary looking like he wanted the earth to swallow him, was just the beginning. Word of the HOA's trespassing, the forced entry, and the subsequent humiliation by law enforcement spread through Whispering Pines estates like wildfire. Mrs. Gable, bless her heart, apparently gave a very detailed, very gleeful eyewitness account to anyone who would listen at the community mailboxes the next morning. The narrative was clear. Brenda, in her hubris, had massively overstepped, been caught red-handed, and had made the entire HOA look like a bunch of entitled fools. Her carefully constructed image of omnipotent authority was shattered. My phone, which had been ringing with her screeching demands the day before, was now strangely silent from her end. Instead, I started getting calls from other neighbors. Some were apologetic, embarrassed by the HOA's actions. A few, who had clearly chafed under Brenda's reign for some time, were quietly congratulatory. "'Bout time someone put that woman in her place, Tom." One older gentleman, who'd had his own run-ins with Brenda over the historically accurate but unapproved color of his colonial-era window shutters, told me with a chuckle. The next HOA meeting, according to Mrs. Gable, who attended with a notebook and a steely glint in her eye, was a bloodbath. Residents who had previously been too intimidated to speak up finally found their voices. Questions were raised about Brenda's judgment, her authoritarian style, and the potential legal liabilities she'd exposed the HOA to. There were apparently calls for her immediate resignation. Gary, the weaselly vice president, reportedly tried to distance himself, claiming he'd had misgivings all along, which earned him scornful laughter. Brenda, usually so composed and cutting, was visibly flustered, her responses defensive and weak. The summer gala, which was supposed to be her crowning achievement, had become her undoing. I, of course, did not attend. I was too busy repairing the pry marks on my ventilation shutter and giving Duke and Earl some extra molasses-sweetened oats as a reward for their unwitting but highly effective service as party bouncers. I also sent a polite, formally worded letter to the HOA board, CCing my lawyer, a cousin who did pro bono work for family when truly egregious nonsense occurred, detailing the trespassing incident, the damage to my property, minor but a matter of principle, and reserving my right to pursue further legal action if there were any future incursions or harassment. I included a bill for the repair of the shutter and a modest animal welfare check fee for the vet to confirm Duke and Earl hadn't suffered undue stress from the intrusion. It wasn't about the money, it was about making a point. They needed to understand that actions have consequences. The HOA, humbled and under pressure from its members, actually paid the bill. It was accompanied by a terse, unsigned letter of apology for the misunderstanding. Brenda, however, did not resign immediately. She clung to power for a few more weeks, a diminished figure, her pronouncements no longer carrying the same intimidating weight, but the damage was done. Her support on the board crumbled. At the following month's meeting, a vote of no confidence was passed, and Brenda Pinter was officially ousted as HOA president. The relief in the community was palpable. Gary, surprisingly, was not chosen to succeed her. The stink of the barn fiasco clung to him too strongly. A more moderate, reasonable resident, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Albright, was elected, and one of her first acts was to propose a review of the HOA bylaws concerning interactions with non-member properties and dispute resolution, emphasizing respect for private property rights. My little stand had, it seemed, triggered a much-needed course correction. Life on my 5 acres returned to its usual rhythm. The grass grew, the chickens laid, and Duke and Earl grazed peacefully, oblivious to their celebrity status as the HOA exterminators, as one witty neighbor had dubbed them. I installed a couple of very visible security cameras pointing towards the barn and my driveway, not because I expected further trouble from the HOA, but as a general deterrent. A man can't be too careful. The story of the Barnyard Bulls versus Brenda became a local legend, recounted with amusement at community barbecues, held in the actual community park, not unwillingly commandeered private property. I became, somewhat reluctantly, a minor hero to those who valued their peace and autonomy. My victory wasn't just personal, it was a win for common sense and the quiet enjoyment of one's own home. Looking back, the whole affair was absurd. The sheer arrogance of assuming they could just take over my property, the comical image of their fancy party being routed by 2 unimpressed bulls, Brenda's meltdown, it was like something out of a farcical play. But it also underscored a serious point. An HOA is supposed to serve the community, not rule it like a petty dictatorship. And sometimes, all it takes to remind them of that is a locked door, a well-timed fishing trip, and a couple of £1,000 reasons why no means no. So, that's how a couple of bulls and a carefully planned absence brought a measure of sanity back to our little corner of the world. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to get creative in defending your property or dealing with an overzealous HOA. I have a feeling there are some incredible stories out there. And if you enjoyed this slice of rural justice, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Catch you on the next one.